Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the most dangerous thing you could do today is speak. Not shout, not protest. Just speak the truth. In this future, silence is no longer a choice. It is the law. And the punishment for breaking it is something far worse than prison. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear might feel uncomfortably close to reality. The year was never officially announced. Governments stopped using dates once words themselves became a threat. History was rewritten into symbols, gestures, and approved expressions displayed on screens. Humanity had learned the hard way that language was powerful enough to break systems, expose lies, and collapse empires. So they did the unthinkable. They outlawed it. At first, it was subtle. A new regulation called the Harmonic Stability Act. Leaders claimed it was designed to reduce misinformation, hate speech, and emotional disruption. News anchors smiled as they explained how limiting certain phrases would create a calmer, safer world. People applauded. They always do at the beginning. Then came the filters. Every device shipped with a built-in silence delay. Speak a sentence, and the system would analyze it before allowing sound to leave your mouth. If your words were deemed unstable, your voice would simply vanish into nothing. No sound, no echo, just silence. People laughed it off. They made jokes in approved ways. They adapted. Humans are good at adapting to cages when the bars are invisible, but truth has a way of leaking through. It started with whispers in private rooms, away from microphones and censors. Parents teaching children forbidden words without sound, shaping syllables with their lips, hoping memory would be enough. Old journalists scribbling banned facts on paper, then burning the pages after reading them once. Silence became the new resistance. That's when the punishments changed. The first official punishment wasn't execution. It was erasure. If you spoke an unapproved truth, your identity was flagged. Your digital existence faded. Bank access gone. Employment history wiped. Friends received automated messages stating you had relocated for social harmony. You were still alive, but to the world, you no longer existed. And for many, that was worse than death. Cities transformed. Streets were quiet, not because people were peaceful, but because fear had learned how to breathe. Public spaces were filled with screens reminding citizens, silence is safety. Words create violence. Truth is contextual. The slogans were everywhere, glowing softly like lullabies meant to put an entire species to sleep. Children grew up never hearing unscripted speech. Schools taught communication through approved gestures and emotion cards. Red meant concern. Blue meant agreement. Yellow meant gratitude. Language was reduced to colors, because colors couldn't ask dangerous questions. But the human mind doesn't forget its nature so easily. Some people began experiencing something called echo sickness. When you suppress thoughts for too long, they don't disappear. They bounce around inside your skull, growing louder. Victims would suddenly scream in their sleep, unleashing years of trapped sentences in a single night. Emergency silence units were deployed to handle these incidents. Neighbors were instructed not to listen. Listening itself was considered a minor offense. There was a myth circulating in the underground silence networks, a rumor about a place where speaking was still possible. Not loudly, not freely, but honestly. They called it the unmuted zone. No one knew if it was real, but the idea alone kept people alive. Hope, even unspoken, can be dangerous. The authorities understood this. That's why they introduced the final phase. Mandatory silence hours became mandatory silence lives. Vocal cords were no longer necessary, they said. Medical upgrades were offered for collective well-being. A painless procedure that permanently disabled the ability to speak. Those who volunteered received better housing, more food credits, higher social trust scores. Those who refused were watched more closely. Most people volunteered, because survival has a way of convincing you that freedom is overrated. Somewhere deep in what used to be a city newsroom, an old broadcaster sat alone in the dark. He had refused the procedure. His voice was weak from years of disuse, but his memory was sharp. He remembered a time when truth wasn't punished, when lies had to hide instead of the other way around. He knew he wouldn't be heard. But he also knew something else. Silence doesn't kill truth. It only delays it. He spoke anyway. The system detected the violation instantly. Alarms never sounded. They didn't need to anymore. Silence was efficient. As his identity was erased, as his world collapsed into digital nothing, his final words echoed only in his own mind. But sometimes, that's enough to start something, because somewhere, someone always hears what they're not supposed to. If this future unsettles you, if it makes you uncomfortable, that means you're still awake. And in a world that fears truth, staying awake is an act of rebellion. Remember that. And if you want to keep exploring these dark futures where humanity crosses lines it can't uncross, you already know where to be. This is Black Future Files. Somewhere, far beneath the silent cities, the echo of that forbidden voice didn't die. It fractured. And in those fractures, something dangerous was born. The unmuted zone was real. It wasn't a place you could find on any map, because maps were made of symbols, and symbols were monitored. It existed in abandoned infrastructure left behind when humanity moved everything into the cloud. Old subway tunnels, decommissioned data centers, forgotten emergency bunkers built for wars that never came. Down there, sensors failed. Networks stuttered. And for the first time in generations, words could exist without permission. The people who lived there called themselves listeners. They didn't speak often. They had learned restraint. When you've lived too long in silence, you understand how precious sound really is. Every word mattered. Every sentence was weighed like a final confession. Most of them were erased citizens, ghosts of the surface world. Teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, journalists, people who once believed truth was a right, not a crime. They survived on stolen power, recycled air, and one shared belief. Silence was never meant to be permanent. They had a plan, not a revolution. Revolutions required speeches, chants, slogans. All impossible. Instead, they aimed for something simpler. A crack. The global silent system depended on one thing above all else: compliance through fear. People had to believe they were alone, that no one else remembered how to speak freely, that resistance was impossible, because resistance had no voice. The listeners wanted to remind the world of something it had forgotten: sound. Using fragments of outlawed technology, they built a device that didn't broadcast words. It broadcasted memories, raw audio from the past, laughter, arguments, confessions, unfiltered human noise, pulled from ancient archives that predated the silence laws. The system couldn't analyze it properly, because it wasn't new speech. It was history. On a day chosen at random to avoid pattern detection, the device activated. Across the world, for exactly 7 seconds, every screen went black. Every slogan disappeared. And then it happened. A child's voice, asking a simple question. A woman crying while telling the truth in court. A crowd cheering, angry, alive. A man whispering, "You're not crazy. You were right." 7 seconds. That was all it took. Panic spread faster than any spoken word ever could. People froze in their homes, hands shaking, hearts racing. Some fell to their knees. Others cried without knowing why. For many, it was the first real human sound they had ever heard. The authorities responded immediately. Emergency protocols triggered worldwide. Silence enforcement reached levels never seen before. Entire districts went dark. Thousands were erased overnight. Official statements blamed a system hallucination and warned citizens not to trust emotional disturbances. But something had changed. You can't unhear truth. People began to experience something new. Not echo sickness. Something stronger. Memory reawakening. Old instincts resurfaced. Mouths moved unconsciously. Throats vibrated with sounds people didn't even recognize as language at first. Children asked their parents questions without gesture cards. Parents didn't know how to respond, but they didn't stop them either. Silence was cracking. The final punishment was announced soon after. Total vocal nullification, mandatory for all remaining citizens. No more volunteering. No more choice. Humanity would be permanently muted to protect itself from itself. That was when fear finally lost. Because when everything is taken from you, you have nothing left to protect. On the day enforcement units arrived to begin the final procedures, something unexpected happened. People stood still. They didn't run. They didn't fight. They simply opened their mouths and spoke, not loudly, not in unison, just one by one. Broken sentences, half-remembered words, truths that had been buried so deep they came out shaking. The system couldn't process it fast enough. Too many violations. Too many voices. The silence filters overloaded. For the first time in decades, cities weren't quiet. They were chaotic. Imperfect. Human. Many paid the price. Erasure. Detainment. Worse. But the idea of silence as an absolute law was dead. You can control bodies. You can erase identities. But once people remember they can speak, you can never fully take that back. The future didn't become free overnight. That's not how dark timelines end. But it changed direction. Slowly. Painfully. Honestly. Silence was no longer mandatory, and truth, once punished, became dangerous again. If this story made you uncomfortable, if it stayed in your mind longer than it should, that's not an accident. Dark futures aren't warnings because they're fictional. They're warnings because they're possible. And as long as voices still exist, so does the chance to stop them from becoming real.